brothers were at this time quite children, and Napoleon used to allow them to sit on his knee and amuse themselves by playing with his orders. More than once, he has desired me to cut them off to please them. One day, Alexander took a pack of cards on which the usual figure of the great mogul. The child held it up to Napoleon, saying, "See, Boney, this is you." He did not understand what my brother meant by calling him Boney. I explained that it was an abbreviation. This short for Bonaparte, but Las Casas interpreted the word literally and said it meant a bony person. Napoleon laughed and said, "Je suis pas sûr," not bony, which he certainly never could have been, even in his thinnest days. His hand was the fattest and prettiest in the world. His knuckles dimpled like those of a baby. His fingers taper and beautifully formed, and his nails perfect. I've often admired its symmetry and was told him it did not look large and strong enough to wield a sword. This led to the subject of swords, and one of the emperor's suite who was present drew his saber from the scabbard and, pointing to some stains on the blade, said that it was the blood of an Englishman. The emperor desired him to sheath it, telling him it was bad taste to boast, particularly before ladies. Napoleon then produced from a richly embossed case the most magnificent sword I ever beheld. The sheath was composed of an entire piece of most splendidly marked tortoiseshell, thickly studded with golden bees. The handle, not unlike a fleur-de-lis in shape, was of exquisitely wrought gold. It was indeed the most costly and elegant weapon I had ever seen. I requested Napoleon to allow me to examine it more closely, and then a circumstance which had occurred in the morning, in which I had been much piqued at the emperor's conduct, flashed across me. The temptation was irresistible, and I determined to punish him for what he had done. I drew the blade out quickly from the scabbard and began to flourish it over his head, making passes at him, the emperor retreating, until at last I fairly pinned him up in the corner. I kept telling him all the time that he had better say his prayers, for I was going to kill him. My exulting cries at last brought my sister to Napoleon's assistance. She scolded me violently, and she said she would inform my father if I did not instantly desist. But I only laughed at her and maintained my post, keeping the emperor at bay until my arm dropped from sheer exhaustion. I can fancy I see the figure of the Grand Chamberlain now, with his spare form and parchment visage, glowing with fear for the emperor's safety and indignation at the insult I was offering him. He looked as if he could have annihilated me on the spot, but he had felt the weight of my hand before in his ears, and prudence dictated him to leave me alone. When I resigned my sword, Napoleon took hold of my ear, which had been bored only the day before, and pinched it, giving me great pain. I called out, and he then took hold of my nose, which he pulled heartily, but quite in fun. His good humor never left him during the whole scene. The following was the circumstance which had excited my ire in the morning. My father was very strict in enforcing our doing a French translation every day, and Napoleon would often condescend to look over them and correct their faults. One morning, I felt more than usually averse to performing this task, and when Napoleon arrived at the cottage and asked whether the translation was ready for him, I had not even begun it. When he saw this, he took up the paper and walked down the lawn with it to my father, who was preparing to mount his horse to ride into the valley, exclaiming as he approached, "Balcon, voilà le thème de Mademoiselle Betsy. Qu'elle a bien travaillé." Look at Mademoiselle Betsy's homework. Look at what good work she's done. Holding up at the same time the blank sheet of paper. My father comprehended imperfectly, but saw by the sheet of paper and my name being mentioned by the laughing emperor that he wished me to be scolded. And entering into the plot, he pretended to be very angry and threatened if I did not finish my translation before he returned to dinner, I should be severely punished. He then rode off, and Napoleon left me laughing at my sullen and mortified air, and it was the recollection of this which made me try and frighten him with the sword. The emperor, in the course of the evening, desired a quantity of bijouterie to be brought down to amuse us, and amongst other things, the miniatures of the young king of Rome. He seemed gratified and delighted when we expressed our admiration to them. He possessed a great many portraits of young Napoleon. One of them represented him sleeping in his cradle, which was in the form of a helmet of Mars. The banner of France waved over his head, and his tiny right hand supported a small globe. I asked the meaning of these emblems, and Napoleon said he was to be a great warrior, and the globe in his hand signified that he was to rule the world. Another miniature on a snuff box represented the little fellow on his knees before a crucifix, his hands clasped and his eyes raised to heaven. Underneath were the words, "J'ai pris le bon Dieu pour mon père, ma mère et ma patrie." I am praying to God for my mother, my father, and my fatherland. It was an exquisite thing. He was portrayed with 2 lambs, on one of which he was riding, while the other he was decking out with ribbons. The emperor told us these lambs were presented to his son by the inhabitants of Paris, an unwarlike emblem, and perhaps intended as a delicate hint to the emperor to make him a more peaceable citizen than his papa. The paschal lamb, however, is, I believe, the badge on the colors of a distinguished English regiment, and perhaps may be intended to remind the soldier that gentleness and mercy are not inconsistent with the fiercer and more lion-like attributes of his profession. We next saw another drawing in which the Empress Maria Louisa and her son were represented, surrounded by a sort of halo of roses and clouds, which I did not admire quite so much as some of the others. Napoleon then said he was going to show us the portrait of the most beautiful woman in the world, and produced an exquisite miniature of his sister Pauline. Certainly, I never saw anything so perfectly lovely. I could not keep my eyes from it. I told him how enchanted I was with it. He seemed pleased with my praises and said it was a proof of taste, for she was perhaps one of the most lovely women that ever existed. The emperor usually played cards every evening, and when we were tired of looking at the miniatures, he said, "Now we will go to the cottage and play whist." We all walked down together. Our little whist table was soon formed, but the cards did not run smoothly, and Napoleon desired Les Causes to seat himself at a side table and deal them until they dealt easily. While the Grand Chamberlain was thus employed, Napoleon asked me what my robe de bal was to be. I must mention that on my father's refusal to allow me to go to the ball, which was to be given by Sir George Cockburn, I had implored the emperor's intercession for me. He most kindly asked my father to let me go, and his request, of course, was instantly acceded to. I now ran upstairs to bring my dress down to him. It was the first ball dress I had ever possessed, and I was not a little proud of it. He said it was very pretty, and the cards being now ready, I placed it on the sofa and sat down to play. Napoleon and my sister were partners, and Les Causes fell to my lot. We had always hitherto played for sugar plums, but tonight Napoleon said, "Mademoiselle Betsy, I will bet you a Napoleon on the game." I had had a pagoda presented to me, which made up the sum of all my worldly riches, and I said I would bet him that against his Napoleon. The emperor agreed to this, and we commenced playing. He seemed determined to terminate this day of espièglerie as he had begun it. Peeping under his cards as they were dealt to him, he endeavored, whenever he got an important one, to draw off my attention, and then slyly held it up for my sister to see. I soon discovered this, and calling him to order, told him he was cheating, and that if he continued to do so, I would not play. At last he revoked intentionally, and at the end of the game tried to mix the cards together to prevent his being discovered. But I started up. In seizing hold of his hands, I pointed out to him and the others what he had done. He laughed until the tears ran out of his eyes and declared he had played fair, but that I had cheated and should pay him the pagoda. And when I persisted that he had revoked, he said I was a méchant and a cheat. And catching up my ball dress from off the sofa. He ran out of the room with it and up to the pavilion, leaving me in terror lest he should crush and spoil all my pretty roses. I instantly set off in chase of him, but he was too quick, and darting through the marquee, he reached the inner room and locked himself in. I then commenced a series of the most pathetic remonstrances and entreaties, both in English and French, to persuade him to restore me my frock, but in vain. He was inexorable, and I had the mortification of hearing him laugh at what I thought the most touching of my appeals. I was obliged to return without it. He afterwards sent down word he intended to keep it, and that I might make up my mind not to go to the ball. I lay awake half the night, and at last cried myself to sleep, hoping he would relent in the morning. But the next day wore away, and I saw no signs of my pretty frock. I sent several entreaties in the course of the day, but the answer was that the emperor slept and could not be disturbed. He had given these orders to tease me. At last the hour arrived for a departure for the valley. The horses were brought round, and I saw the little black boys ready to start with our tin cases, without, alas, my beautiful dress being in them. I was in despair and hesitated whether I should not go in my plain frock rather than not go at all, when to my great joy, I saw the emperor running down the lawn to the gate with my dress. "Here, Miss Betsy, I brought you your dress. I hope you are a good girl now, and that you will like the ball. And mind that you dance with Gorgo." Gorgo was not very handsome, and I had some childish feud with him. I was all delighted getting back my dress, and still more pleased to find my roses were not spoiled. He said he had ordered them to be arranged and pulled out in case any might have been crushed the night before. Napoleon walked by the side of our horses until he came to the end of the bridle road which led to the briars. He then stopped and remarked on the beauty of a house which was situated in the valley beneath us, asking to whom it belonged, and expressing his intention of going down to see it. Las Casas accompanied the emperor down the side of the mountain, and we went on to the ball. He mentioned the next day how charmed he had been at the place, and that he had ridden home on a beautiful little Arab pony belonging to the owner, Major Hodson.